On January 15, 2008, Steve Jobs came out on stage and pulled a legendary product out of an envelope, instantly blowing everyone's mind and changing the laptop world forever. And now, almost 14 years later, Apple's about to do it again with the new M2 MacBook Air. But this time, with white bezels, a white keyboard, a flat design, and a notch? Well, we've got a lot of leaks and rumors to unload, so let's jump right into it. The story of the M2 MacBook Air leaks started around 6 months ago from Jon Prosser from Front Page Tech. As you can see right here, he revealed exclusive renders of that M2 MacBook Air. Just like this, you have this flat design, looks incredibly clean. These renders look so good, but the thing I want you guys to look at is how thin that design is. It is just so incredibly thin. You see a USB-C port right there, and the entire design is just slightly larger. And as we can see, we have off-white bezels and an off-white keyboard. But recently, we just got some fresh leaks, and they are very controversial and definitely new because these renders did not show any sort of notch. And now, this is what the rumors are pointing us to. Look at that. The same notch that I have right here on this 16-inch MacBook Pro in white. That just looks so crazy, and to me, I'm honestly not even sure about if they're actually gonna do this or not with the M2 MacBook Air, because that honestly looks kind of bad. Now, this particular leak came from DylanDKT on Twitter. As you can see right here, here is his Twitter page, and he's fairly new, but he's actually pretty reliable. He gave us a lot of little tidbits on what we should expect from it, but I am kind of worried about a couple of things. So before I break all of this down, the first thing I want to mention is the design before we get into the M2 chip and the whole theory about the notch or no notch. The first detail he mentioned was MagSafe, which we just got on the new MacBook Pros. So in my opinion, it totally makes sense to add the MagSafe 3rd gen connector onto the MacBook Air as well, because this year they made it super slim compared to what it was like before, so it can definitely fit on an incredibly thin MacBook Air. He also mentioned that it's gonna be getting a 1080p webcam, and I don't know if you guys have seen the comparisons between the old one and the new one, but there is definitely a huge difference in terms of sharpness, and it's definitely welcome. So I think that Apple is for sure adding that 1080p webcam. Now, interestingly, Dylan says that we're getting USB Type-C ports, which I would expect Thunderbolt 4 because that's the latest and best port. But if it's gonna be a MacBook and maybe it's not tuned for professionals, maybe it won't, because if you think about it, the old 12-inch MacBook from 2017, it only had a single USB-C port, not Thunderbolt. So what if Apple is actually gonna do that same thing? So I'm not exactly sure which way, but I really hope they give us 2 Thunderbolt 4 ports for the extra connectivity. Now, moving on, we have the 30-watt power adapter, which totally makes sense. And of course, he says no fans, which I totally agree with. And if you look at how thin those renders are from Ian Zelbo and Jon Prosser, I don't think there's any way you could fit a fan there. And since the M1 MacBook Air is fanless and it performs incredibly well, as we've shown you in all of our reviews, I totally expect Apple to not put any sort of fan on that MacBook Air. And then he mentions the various color options on that new M2 MacBook Air, similar to the iMac 24-inch, and I think that is gonna be very interesting because it feels like Apple is kind of trying to revolutionize the game by not just sticking to standard silver, space gray, or black laptops like we've been having for a long time, but switching it up and giving people colors like the AirPods Max, almost like somebody can match up their entire ecosystem with their AirPods Max, their MacBook Air, their iPads having all these colors. It's like they're going for that new consumer level, and that is why Dylan believes we're getting off-white bezels with an off-white keyboard, since that's what Apple did with the 24-inch iMac, and it seems to be working because it's selling well and people are loving it, and I think people are also gonna love the light colored bezels. But now this brings us into the very controversial bits of info that people are having a hard time agreeing with. For example, Dylan says that mini LED is likely. Now that is interesting because as we know, the new MacBook Pros have the mini LED ProMotion displays, and Dylan does not believe that the new MacBook Air is gonna have ProMotion. And I totally agree, there is not gonna be 120 Hz ProMotion on the MacBook Air because that's a lower end, cheaper consumer item compared to the Pro MacBook Pro that deserves ProMotion. But mini LED is still in the air. Of course, there's not gonna be any Face ID and no SD card because that's a Pro feature, and of course no HDMI and no tapered design, which Dylan mentioned, and that makes sense because they're going all flat with these new MacBooks just like they did with this new MacBook Pro. And as you can see right here, Jon Prosser from Front Page Tech actually updated his renders with Ian Zelbo, and they're showing off the ports that we should expect, and he believes that we are getting 2 Thunderbolt 4 ports on each side. And here you can see that MagSafe 3 is so thin that it still fits just fine on the M2 MacBook Air, including the headphone jack just barely fitting. So this gives you a sense of how insanely thin this MacBook is gonna be. And this is why I believe it's gonna disrupt the entire laptop industry, because this is just gonna blow people's minds having such a thin device, like as thin as an iPad Pro. It's just gonna be crazy. But this right here is what is very controversial. Look at that notch. I've gotta say that's pretty ugly. I'm just having a hard time believing that Apple is gonna give a notch to the MacBook Air with white bezels, because as you can see, I just went into full screen mode and the entire notch on this MacBook Pro just disappeared because the notch is black and the screen is black. Now imagine if you're on this M2 MacBook Air and the rest of that goes black, but you literally still see a light colored notch right there. I just can't see it working. I'm finding it hard to believe that Apple would actually do this. Now, of course, one option is just to cut a line here and then literally display the light colored bezel on the display to make it seamless and make it look like it's a fully squared display, white colored without the notch. But you're gonna be running into issues with white balance and everything else, so I don't think Apple is gonna go that route. However, we got a bombshell leak from LeaksApplePro, who says he has an exclusive leak of the actual CAD files for the M2 MacBook Air. And as you can see, here they are. Everything looks normal. You have your headphone jack, your Thunderbolt 4 port right there, same thing right here, Thunderbolt 4, MagSafe 3. So this looks like it could actually be official CAD files, but he gave us a very, very interesting tidbit. He says that there will not be a notch, and based on his renders and his CAD files, he was able to create this render right here, and as you can see, there is no notch on this M2 MacBook Air. Now, what really got me thinking is the original reasoning for the notch for the MacBook Pro. Now, Apple says they were able to basically thin down the bezels like crazy, as you can see right here, incredibly thin bezels by adding that notch in. So my thought is, what if Apple is not gonna give us those crazy thin bezels on the M2 MacBook Air, and they're gonna give us the thicker bezels and basically kind of force us to spend more money if we want super thin bezels by only going for the MacBook Pro. So essentially, the cheaper M2 MacBook Air would still stick to the thick bezels, and therefore they would be able to kind of redesign that camera and stick it up there into the bezel and not have any notch at all. And in my opinion, if Apple is gonna go for light colored keyboard and light colored bezels, this makes the absolute most sense right here. But if by any chance we do get a notch, which I honestly don't think we're gonna get, I don't think that it's gonna look this bad, because as you can see, there's like this dark line going around this notch to kind of make it more visible. I don't think it's gonna be anything like that. I think it's gonna be more seamless and it's gonna blend better into the wallpaper, so it's not gonna look this bad. Now, moving on to the next bit of info that Dylan gave us, he says that there's a chance that this laptop might not actually be the MacBook Air. It could be just straight MacBook, like we had with the 12-inch MacBook that was totally discontinued and it doesn't exist right now. So what if Apple is gonna revive the MacBook as this new laptop? And this might actually make sense to me, because this new potential MacBook could totally replace the lower end 13-inch MacBook Pro, because Apple could be basically forcing us to pay $2,000 for the newer, more expensive, high-performance MacBook Pro, and they could just give us a MacBook for the middle ground in between the MacBook Air, the MacBook, and the MacBook Pro. So essentially, it's already been in the leaks that the M1 MacBook Air is gonna stick around at the same $1,000 price point for maybe at least another year, and then this thing's gonna come in to fill in a gap, and that's what I think is gonna happen. So I think there is a good chance that Apple could just straight up call it a MacBook. And now, of course, everybody's talking about the M2 MacBook Air, which points to the M2 chip, and I know a lot of you guys have questions about that, so let's get right into it and answer them. This brings us to a report from Mark Gurman from last year in January saying that it's gonna be getting a next-gen chip. So what that means is that you could basically look at the M1 chip, which is an 8-core, and then basically the next generation, kind of like Apple goes from A11 to A12, A13, A14 chip. They're gonna do the same thing with the M1, basically just upgrade it with new technology. Now what's interesting here is that Mark Gurman mentioned that it's gonna be getting 2 USB-C ports. He also did not mention Thunderbolt, so this might actually mean that we're only getting USB-C for, I guess, the regular average consumers. And before we jump into the core count, Mark Gurman actually mentioned that it's gonna be getting 2 USB-C ports, not Thunderbolt, which is very interesting, and it's gonna be releasing as early as the second half of 2021, which we know is not happening this year. It definitely got delayed, but he mentioned that Apple considered a 15-inch version of the MacBook Air, but they completely scrapped it. So I know a lot of people are still wondering if we're getting a 15-inch, but it looks like we are not getting it. It's still sticking to 13 inches according to Mark Gurman. And as far as the M2 chip, DylanDKT also believes we're getting the M2 within the first half of 2022, and it's gonna debut with the new colorful MacBook. Now, as far as the core counts, Mark Gurman gave us some info back in May saying that the M2 is gonna have the same 8-core CPU, so that's 4 performance cores and 4 efficiency cores, but in terms of the graphics, it's now gonna be basically up to 10 cores for the GPU, but you could get 9 on the base model, which he believes it's still gonna be binned, so you're gonna be able to save some money with the binned 9-core GPU instead of the full 10. But the big question we have to answer is, what is it gonna be based on? Because a lot of people were thinking it could be based on the 3nm technology from TSMC, but now it looks like that has been delayed, so DigiTimes has reported that it's gonna be based on the 4nm tech. However, they came back with an update saying that the N4P process is actually TSMC's third major advancement of the 5nm family. So it's not even gonna go down to 4nm, it's gonna be sticking to 5nm, but delivering an 11% performance boost. So that is very interesting because a lot of people thought that 4nm tech was ready, but it looks like it might not be due to this report. Now there's actually a lot to break down here because it's saying it's 11% boost over N5 and only 6% over N4. Now what that means is that the original N5 tech is actually the A14 chip and the M1, so the M1 MacBook Air, so it's gonna give an 11% boost, basically with the same clock speeds over the M1, but the N4 technology is actually the 2nd gen 5nm, which is the A15 chip. So that's very interesting. But what's really gonna matter is this right here. N4P will deliver a 22% improvement in power efficiency, as well as a 6% improvement in transistor density. So basically, this is gonna mean a lot of things for the battery life. You're gonna get much better battery life, and it seems like the whole design is gonna run cooler, so of course they can make it thinner without sacrificing heat or anything like that. And now the last thing we've got to discuss is the release date, because that's obviously what all of us want to know, and that brings us back to a report from Ming-Chi Kuo on August 10th, and he was claiming that a new redesigned MacBook Air with mini LED, so he believes it will get mini LED and color options, is launching in mid-2022. Now what mid meant to me was WWDC, because that's right in the middle in June, so it seems like that's the perfect event for Apple to unveil or reveal this new MacBook Air, because it's gonna be the 2-year anniversary ever since Apple basically announced the Apple Silicon transition. Now, however, Ming-Chi Kuo recently came out and he now says that it's gonna enter mass production in the third quarter of 2022. So that basically means that Apple is again delaying it, so they're not going to be even beginning the production until the third quarter, so that makes a WWDC reveal unlikely. So that basically means that a reveal at WWDC is not likely, and it's going to take until October or November for Apple to reveal the new MacBook Air. Now, in my opinion, what this points to is Apple starting a tick-tock cycle. So for example, one year they reveal the lower end products like the MacBook Air, and then another year they reveal the higher end products like the MacBook Pro. So that's basically 2 years in between the MacBook Pros releasing and getting updated. And that's why I believe it's gonna be until 2023 until the new MacBook Pro gets updated again. So that's very interesting that it seems like Apple is going this route, but this is definitely gonna be exciting. But with all that said and out of the way, let me just wrap up exactly what I think this M2 MacBook Air is gonna look like and be like. I feel like the design is gonna be exactly like you see right here, just basically identical in terms of the white keyboard, just like we have on the external keyboards with the iMacs currently, like the 24-inch iMac. And I also think that the design from the side is gonna look almost identical, just like this render from Ian Zelmo and Jon Prosser. However, it might be just slightly thicker maybe, because it seems like there's just not enough room here, especially with that headphone jack, but I guess we will see. And then in my opinion, I do not think we're gonna be getting a notch like that. I think Apple is just gonna give us thicker bezels and somehow find a way to bring that webcam a little bit higher so that it basically is gonna end up looking like this, except I don't think we're gonna have rounded corners on the bottom, maybe only on the top, but I guess we will see. So with that said, hopefully you enjoyed this video on the leaks and rumors on the M2 MacBook Air, and if you did, definitely click the circle button to subscribe for more videos like this one, and check out one of those 2 videos right over there. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.